Greetings, this is Alicia, and I'm here to show you how to prepare your armature for our hand modeling class. First, take your board, which should be roughly 12 by 12 by 3/4 inches thick, and we're going to find the center of the board by creating an X that goes from corner to corner. Where the two lines cross over each other will be the center of the board. Please mark that with a pencil. Next, you're going to drill a hole in the center of the board using a 3/8 inch drill bit. You can either go all the way through or just most of the way through if you're careful, staying as vertical as possible. Now set aside the board and measure out 8 3/4 inches on your dowel rod. Then use a saw to cut off the 8 3/4 inch piece that you'll be using. We'll have one more preliminary step to do before we glue the rod into the hole, which is if you've drilled all the way through the board, fill the hole at least halfway with some crumpled up paper, and you can jam it in with a pencil to get it deep down in the hole, and that will keep the glue from dripping out the other side. When you're ready, you're going to glue the dowel rod into the hole, coating the entire end of the dowel rod generously with glue. And if necessary, you might need to use a mallet or light taps with a hammer to really make sure that it's inserted as deeply as it can go. If the glue is squeezing out around the side, that's a good sign. And now the board and dowel are assembled, and you'll have to leave them for several hours or overnight for the glue to dry before you tamper with it any further. After the glue is dried, it's time to measure your hand so we can decide how long the wires have to be. From that bump on your forearm, where your ulna ends, to the tip of your middle finger is the length that you want to record, and then add 3 inches onto that. For example, my finger measured 7 inches, and I am cutting wires that are going to be 10 inches long each. I'm using the 1/8 inch aluminum armature wire in this case, and these are going to actually be the wires that support the fingers from inside, the clay on the fingers. We want to get 5 of these at this point at equal length, and eventually we'll trim them to reflect the relative length of each finger. This will be easier for assembly purposes. With all your wires cut, now measure 3 inches down from the top of your dowel rod that's assembled on the board, and make a mark with a sharpie at 3 inches from the top. Next, to help you be able to assemble the armature more easily, we're going to use masking tape to temporarily hold the wires so that the bottom point of each wire is at about that height of that sharpie mark that we just made. Once the tape is holding the wires in place at the right height on your dowel rod, you're going to take one of your hose clamps, still closed in a circle, and slide it over the wires and onto a place where it's holding the lower end of the wires onto the dowel rod. At that point, you can use a screwdriver or a small socket wrench if you have it to tighten the hose clamp until it's firmly holding the wires onto the dowel rod. You're going to be using a second hose clamp to attach the wires onto the dowel rod at a slightly higher point, maybe an inch or so above the first one. Make sure you tighten both of them really well, and having 2 points of attachment will make it much more secure when you're trying to move the wires around. If you can, have both of the hose clamps facing in the same direction, and this will be easier to bury them in the clay. If everything works out correctly, you should have about 8 inches of armature wire above the dowel rod on all 5 wires. We will be trimming it, but it's good to have a little extra to work with when you begin the process. Spread out the fingers a little bit, and next we're going to be candy cane wrapping each of the wires with 24 gauge or 22 gauge, a very fine gauge steel wire, and wrap it around in a spiraling motion so that there's some texture on the round wire, and that will help the clay stay in place a little bit better. Without the wrapping, sometimes with delicate fingers, the clay can spin on the armature or slide off, and it can be very difficult to work with. So you can see how I hold the end of the wire against the armature wire and then wrap over the end of it, making a spiraling motion, and it'll end up looking sort of like candy cane stripes if you play your cards right. And I'll wrap it right up to the end and then make some closer wraps at the very end to kind of have a place to tuck the wire in. Also make sure that the sharp ends of the wire are tucked as tightly as possible against the original armature wire. You can use pliers to actually squish the ends of the wire and flatten them against the aluminum wire. There will always be sharp ends on an armature, but it's good to hide them and make them point away from you as much as possible. so that you don't end up cutting your fingers. I also advise caution when using the armature when putting on the initial clay. For good measure with this project, I also took a thicker gauge wire, 20 gauge steel wire, which can be purchased at a hardware store, and did some candy cane wrapping on the wooden dowel rod, just so that the wrist portion and forearm portion that we're going to be sculpting doesn't slide around on you too much either. I would say this step isn't absolutely essential, but if you have the wire around, go ahead and wrap it. It's not going to hurt anything, and it'll only make it easier to use the armature. So again, just as a review, that wire wrapping is really to create texture on slippery surfaces so the clay will grab on and not want to spin around or slip around as much when you're trying to model it and reshape it. It can be really useful in some situations, especially with thinner forms like fingers. As I get down toward the bottom of the dowel rod, again, I'm going to do some tighter, closer together wraps and try to hide the loose end of the wire as much as possible using pliers or some other metal tool to smush the wire against the dowel rod and make it very close to the previous circle of wire so that it's not as likely to snag my finger or snag on my clothing. And then our finished result will be a life-size hand armature with all of the finger wires candy cane wrapped and nice tight hose clamps holding the wires onto the dowel.